Imagine a Trojan horse rolling across the U.S. Mexico border, not with soldiers inside, but with billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. This is the warning Donald Trump has issued, claiming Mexico is being used as a secret gateway for Chinese trade to infiltrate the U.S. economy. But here's the twist: Mexico, not China, is now America's top trading partner. In 2023, trade between the U.S. and Mexico hit a staggering $798 billion, surpassing China for the first time in decades. But what if a big chunk of this trade is actually Chinese products disguised as Mexican? This isn't just political rhetoric, it's a potential game changer in the U.S.-China trade war. For years, the U.S. has tried to cut dependency on Chinese goods with tariffs and policies aimed at reshoring jobs. But Trump suggests that China has found a clever workaround, using Mexico's trade agreements to bypass American tariffs. If this is true, it's not just an economic loophole, it's a direct challenge to U.S. sovereignty and its ability to enforce trade rules. The implications are massive: jobs, industries, and even America's geopolitical standing could be at stake. This is the Atlas Shift, and we are uncovering for you the layers of this claim. Is Mexico really China's Trojan horse? How deep does this go, and what could it mean for the U.S. economy? Let's dive in and find out. The claim that Mexico is a Trojan horse for Chinese trade isn't just born out of speculation, it's rooted in the seismic shifts that have occurred in global trade over the past few years. To truly understand this dynamic, we need to start with the economic rivalry between the United States and China. Since 2018, the U.S. and China have been locked in a heated trade war. The U.S. imposed tariffs on $550 billion worth of Chinese goods, aiming to curb its massive $380 billion trade deficit with Beijing. In retaliation, China slapped tariffs on $185 billion worth of American exports. This tit-for-tat battle sent ripples through the global economy, disrupting supply chains and forcing businesses to rethink where and how they manufactured their goods. Many companies began searching for alternative production hubs to avoid the escalating costs of doing business with China. Enter Mexico. Over the past decade, Mexico has quietly risen to become an economic powerhouse, solidifying its place as one of America's most critical trade partners. This shift was fueled in part by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020. The agreement ensured tariff-free access for goods produced in Mexico, provided they met specific content requirements. Mexico's proximity to the U.S. makes it an ideal alternative for companies relocating production. Shipping from Mexico is faster and cheaper than from China, and while labor costs are higher than China's, they remain far below U.S. levels. By 2023, Mexico's share of U.S. imports rose to 15.6%, while China's fell from 21% in 2017 to 15%, reflecting a major supply chain shift. However, reports show that Chinese firms, especially in electronics, automotive, and textiles, are setting up factories in Mexico, raising concerns in Washington. Critics argue this allows China to bypass U.S. tariffs, leveraging Mexico's trade agreements. The shifting trade dynamics between the U.S., China, and Mexico have reshaped global supply chains. On paper, it seems like the U.S. has successfully pivoted away from reliance on China. But Donald Trump argues that this shift isn't what it seems. In his view, China has simply found a backdoor, and that door leads straight through Mexico. He believes Mexico is not just a trade partner, but a Trojan horse for Chinese goods. According to him, Chinese companies have strategically positioned themselves in Mexico to take advantage of its favorable trade agreements with the United States. By setting up manufacturing plants south of the border, these firms can label their goods as made in Mexico, gaining tariff-free access to the U.S. market under the USMCA. Trump sees this as a direct threat to the effectiveness of the tariffs he implemented during his presidency, which were designed to protect American industries and jobs. One of Trump's key examples is the automotive sector. In recent years, Chinese automakers like BYD have invested heavily in Mexico. In 2023, BYD opened a $700 million production plant in the country, with plans to export electric vehicles directly to the U.S. Similarly, Chinese electronics manufacturers have also expanded their operations in Mexico, assembling everything from smartphones to home appliances. Trump's concerns are supported by data. Reports indicate that indirect Chinese exports to the U.S. through Mexico reached $34 billion in 2023, a significant increase from previous years. This raises questions about how much of Mexico's trade growth with the U.S. is truly Mexican and how much is being driven by Chinese firms exploiting the system. For Trump, this isn't just an economic issue, it's a geopolitical one. He has repeatedly warned that China is using its growing presence in Mexico to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere, potentially challenging U.S. dominance in its own backyard. Trump's warnings paint a stark picture of China cleverly navigating around U.S. tariffs by leveraging Mexico's trade agreements. But are these claims just political rhetoric, or is there tangible evidence to back them up? The idea of China exploiting Mexico to access the U.S. market might sound like a conspiracy theory, but the numbers and case studies tell a compelling story. In recent years, there's been a significant increase in Chinese companies setting up operations in Mexico, particularly in sectors like automotive, electronics, and textiles. One striking example is the electric vehicle industry. Besides BYD, several Chinese companies, including Chang'an and Great Wall Motors, have begun expanding into Mexico, taking advantage of its proximity to the U.S. and tariff-free trade under the USMCA. Electronics manufacturing has also seen a sharp rise. A report by the Wall Street Journal in 2023 highlighted how companies like Hisense and TCL, major players in the global electronics market, are ramping up operations in Mexico to meet North American demand. Additionally, customs data reveals intriguing patterns. Products like electronics, automotive parts, and machinery, traditionally dominated by Chinese exports, are increasingly being labeled as made in Mexico. Analysts suggest that some of these goods are partially or fully produced in China before being shipped to Mexico for minor assembly or relabeling, enabling them to qualify for tariff-free access to the U.S. market. Supply chain experts have also pointed out that Chinese investment in Mexican infrastructure has grown significantly. For instance, China's Costco Shipping has expanded its presence in Mexico's ports, including the port of Manzanillo, a critical gateway for goods entering the North American market. These investments further facilitate the flow of Chinese goods into the U.S., often under the guise of Mexican trade. Even U.S. officials have acknowledged the issue. A 2023 report from the U.S. International Trade Commission highlighted the challenges of enforcing rules of origin under the USMCA, noting that some goods exported from Mexico to the U.S. may not meet the agreement's strict requirements. This lack of enforcement provides a loophole that Chinese companies are eager to exploit. The evidence paints a clear picture. Chinese companies are not just passively benefiting from Mexico's trade agreements, they're actively reshaping their strategies to use Mexico as a gateway to the U.S. market. If Mexico is serving as a gateway for Chinese goods into the U.S., the economic consequences could be significant. A key concern is the potential loss of American manufacturing jobs. Over 5 million have already been lost since 2000, largely due to globalization and competition from lower-cost countries like China. Using Mexico's trade agreements, Chinese companies could further undermine U.S. industries. In the automotive sector, which directly employs nearly 1 million Americans, cheaper EVs from Chinese automakers like BYD, produced in Mexico, could put intense pressure on U.S. giants like Ford and General Motors. The impact goes beyond jobs. The U.S. trade deficit with China was $382 billion in 2023. While trade with Mexico appears balanced, hidden Chinese influence in Mexican exports could distort these figures, undercutting efforts to address the deficit. Geopolitically, China's growing presence in Mexico undermines U.S. leverage in trade negotiations. With Mexico deeply tied to the U.S. economy, this blurs economic influence and complicates the enforcement of rules under agreements like the USMCA. The U.S. risks losing control over its trade policies, yielding power to both Mexico and China. Strategically, Mexico's role as a hub for Chinese goods bolsters China's influence in the Western Hemisphere. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road, China has already invested billions in Belt and Road Latin America, from Brazilian infrastructure to Panamanian ports. Mexico could become a key part of this strategy, challenging U.S. dominance in its region. The impact is already visible. Small and medium-sized U.S. manufacturers in industries like electronics and textiles struggle to compete. A 2023 report by the National Association of Manufacturers estimated unfair trade practices, including indirect imports from China, cost the U.S. economy $85 billion annually. The implications of Chinese goods infiltrating the U.S. market via Mexico are far-reaching. With the stakes so high, the question remains, what can be done about it? Donald Trump has proposed bold measures to address this issue, focusing on stricter enforcement of trade rules under the USMCA. Central to his strategy is tightening the agreement's rules of origin requirements, which mandate that a certain percentage of a product's components must come from North America to qualify for tariff-free trade. Without stronger enforcement, Trump argues, Chinese goods will continue exploiting loopholes by posing as Mexican exports. For instance, the U.S. MCA requires 75% of an automobile's parts to be North American made to avoid tariffs. Trump has suggested audits and enhanced monitoring to ensure compliance, particularly in industries where Chinese influence is significant. A 2023 report by the U.S. Trade Representative highlighted lax enforcement that has allowed products with substantial Chinese content to bypass tariffs. Trump's plan includes empowering customs officials to prevent rebranded goods from entering the U.S. market. Trump has also proposed imposing new tariffs on goods imported from Mexico, echoing his 2018 tariffs on Chinese products, which ranged from 10% to 25% and affected $360 billion in trade. He argues that similar measures could pressure Chinese companies and the Mexican government to alter their practices. However, critics warn this could strain U.S. Mexico relations and provoke retaliation. Additionally, Trump emphasizes incentivizing domestic manufacturing. During his presidency, policies like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced corporate taxes to encourage businesses to return to the U.S. He now suggests expanding these incentives, along with subsidies for critical industries like semiconductors and electric vehicles, to counter Chinese competition. Finally, Trump has hinted at renegotiating the U.S. MCA. Although it's often hailed as one of his key achievements, he believes adjustments are necessary to explicitly limit non-North American components in trade agreements, protecting U.S. interests in an evolving global economy. Trump has controversially proposed re-examining Mexico's role as a trade partner. He has criticized the Mexican government for ignoring Chinese investments and suggested measures like withholding economic aid or imposing sanctions to pressure compliance. Supporters see this as a testament to Trump's dedication to protecting American workers and industries. However, critics warn that such actions, including tariffs and renegotiating agreements, could lead to economic and diplomatic fallout. While Trump's bold proposals aim to safeguard U.S. industries and address the Trojan horse of Chinese goods through Mexico, they have ignited intense debate over their potential consequences. One of the primary arguments against his approach is the potential for economic backlash. For instance, imposing tariffs on Mexican goods could hurt American consumers. A tariff war with Mexico could lead to higher prices for everyday goods, from cars to electronics, disproportionately impacting middle and lower income households. Moreover, critics point to the unintended consequences of past trade wars. When Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, American businesses and consumers bore the brunt of the costs. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated that U.S. companies paid $46 billion in additional import taxes during the trade war, many of which were passed on to consumers. Economists argue that similar tariffs on Mexico could exacerbate inflation, undoing recent economic recovery efforts. Another counterpoint focuses on the feasibility of stricter trade enforcement. Critics argue that enhancing customs inspections and audits under the U.S. MCA sounds good in theory but is difficult to implement effectively. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency is already stretched thin, managing over $2.5 trillion in imports annually. Adding more layers of scrutiny could slow supply chains, increasing costs for American businesses. Then there's the diplomatic angle. Mexico is a vital ally, not just in trade but also in addressing migration, drug trafficking, and regional security. Critics warn that aggressively targeting Mexico with tariffs or sanctions could strain the U.S.-Mexico relationship, pushing Mexico closer to China and undermining American influence in the region. This aligns with a broader concern about Trump's approach potentially alienating allies while failing to address the root causes of Chinese economic strategies. Some argue that Trump's focus on tariffs and enforcement overlooks the need for proactive solutions. For instance, instead of penalizing Mexico, the U.S. could increase investments in domestic industries and incentivize reshoring. Programs like the CHIPS Act of 2022, which allocated $52 billion to boost U.S. semiconductor production, demonstrate how targeted investments can reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. Additionally, not all Chinese operations in Mexico are necessarily harmful to the U.S. market. Trade experts argue that some Chinese investments, particularly in infrastructure and technology, can benefit North American supply chains by increasing efficiency and reducing costs. Painting all Chinese activity in Mexico as a threat might oversimplify a complex issue, potentially leading to overreactions that harm U.S. interests. Finally, some critics question whether Trump's proposals address the broader challenge of globalization. Chinese companies using Mexico as a production hub is a symptom of deeper shifts in global trade dynamics. Unless the U.S. addresses these systemic issues, such as labor cost disparities and global supply chain dependence, tackling individual loopholes may only provide temporary relief. Trump's warning about Mexico being a Trojan horse for Chinese trade has certainly opened a crucial debate about U.S. trade policy and national security. While his proposals to enforce stricter tariffs, renegotiate trade deals, and crack down on trade loopholes may seem like a path to protecting American industries, the broader economic, diplomatic, and strategic implications suggest the solution is far from simple. Now, I'll leave it up to you. Do you think Trump's concerns are justified, or is there another way to address the growing influence of China in U.S. trade? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.